Okay, now human respiratory system. Let's know how the air travels from the atmosphere to the lungs. First, we have a pair of external nostrils. From there, it will reach to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. Write this. From the external nostrils, air enters through the external nostrils, and from the external nostrils, it will reach nasal chamber. Through nasal passage, air enters through external nostrils and it will reach from the external nostrils to nasal chamber through nasal passage, and from then air will reach to the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx is a portion of pharynx. Pharynx is the common passage for food and also the air. Portion of pharynx, and it is the common passage for food and also air. And from then, from nasopharynx, air will enter trachea. From nasopharynx, air will enter the trachea, but how? Through the glottis portion of the larynx region. What it is really? Let me tell you. Okay, let me repeat. Air enters through the external nostrils, and from the external nostrils, air will reach nasal chamber through the nasal passage. From the nasal chamber, it will reach to the nasopharynx, which is a portion of pharynx that is common passage for food and also the air. From nasopharynx, air will enter to the trachea through the glottis of the larynx region. That is, glottis is a part of larynx through which the air enters to the trachea. So the glottis is a part of larynx through which the air enters to the trachea. During swallowing, to prevent the entry of food to the larynx, glottis have a covering that is cartilaginous flap called epiglottis. Epiglottis is a cartilaginous flap which prevents entry of food to the larynx, and larynx is the cartilaginous box that which produces sound, so it is also called sound box. Okay, trachea is a straight tube and it extends up to the fifth thoracic vertebra. It is a straight tube and it extends up to fifth thoracic vertebra. Then it divides into left and right primary bronchi. It divides into left and right primary bronchi. From then, primary bronchi divides into secondary. Secondary bronchi. Then secondary bronchi divides into tertiary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi finally becomes terminal bronchi. Then this terminal bronchi gives vascularized sac-like structures called alveoli. So let me repeat this once again. Air enters through external nostrils and reaches nasal chamber through nasal passage. Then from the nasal chamber, air will reach nasopharynx, which is a portion of pharynx that is the common passage for food and also the air. Then from the nasopharynx, through glottis of the larynx region, that is a glottis is the part of larynx, and the air enters through the glottis and it reaches trachea. So the glottis is covered by epiglottis during swallowing to prevent the entry of food to the larynx. Then larynx is a cartilaginous box which is used to produce sound. So it is also called sound box. Then trachea is a straight tube and it reaches up to the fifth thoracic vertebra, and then it divides into right primary bronchi and left primary bronchi. Let's look at the left primary bronchi. Left primary bronchi will divide into secondary bronchi, then secondary bronchi divides into tertiary, tertiary into terminal, and terminal bronchi gives rise to vascularized, irregular walled, sac-like structures called alveoli. So, and there is a division called conducting part and also the respiratory or exchanging part. From trachea up to the terminal bronchi. Remember, from trachea up to the terminal bronchi, it is called conducting part. From trachea, from the beginning of the trachea to the terminal bronchi, it is called conducting part. Then alveoli and its ducts comprise the respiratory or exchange respiratory or exchanging part of the respiratory system. So from the beginning of the trachea to the terminal bronchi, it comprises conducting part. What is the work of conducting part? It brings the air from the atmosphere to the lungs, and it humidifies the air, and it also brings the air to the temperature of the body, and it also clears the foreign particles that are entering. Okay, now what is the work of respiratory or exchanging part? It is the actual part where the gases, that is CO2 and O2, are actually exchanged. So this is the part, that is respiratory or exchanging part, is the actual site of diffusion of O2 and CO2. Okay, now, and this bronchioles and the terminal bronchi, alveoli and the ducts comprise the lungs. Okay, now clear? This is the passage of the air from the atmosphere to the lungs. That is starting from the external nostrils it will reach nasal chamber through the nasal passage, and from the nasal chamber it will reach to the nasopharynx, and this is the portion of the pharynx which is the common passage for food and also the air. And from the nasopharynx it will reach to the trachea through the glottis of larynx region. This glottis is covered by epiglottis during swallowing to prevent the entry of food to the larynx. And then larynx is called as sound box as it produces sound. Next, trachea is a straight tube and it divides at the fifth thoracic vertebra, and it divides into left and right primary bronchi. Then primary bronchi divides into secondary into tertiary into terminal, and terminal bronchi gives the alveoli, that is irregular sac-like vascular structures. Okay, now this is conducting part and this is respiratory part. Conducting part comprises trachea, primary bronchioles, secondary bronchioles, tertiary bronchioles, and the terminal bronchi. It brings the air from the atmosphere to the lungs, and it humidifies, and it also brings the air to the body temperature, and it also clears the foreign particles that are entering. Next, this respiratory or exchanging part is the actual site of diffusion of O2 and CO2. Okay, now let's try to understand this diagram. This trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and the initial parts of the bronchioles are supported with the incomplete cartilaginous rings. This is the incomplete cartilaginous ring supporting trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, and the initial parts of the bronchioles. Okay, now coming into the covering of the lungs, it has double layered pleura. So the outer layer is called thoracic pleural layer, and it is sticky with the thorax. The inner layer is called pleural layer, and it is sticky with the lungs. And between these two layers, there is a fluid called pleural fluid. So this fluid prevents the friction. Prevents the friction on the lung wall. Okay, so these are the incomplete cartilaginous rings. And this is the pleural layer. And this is the pleural fluid. And the lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber. Thoracic chamber is an airtight chamber, and the thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column and ventrally with the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and the lower side it is formed by the dome-shaped structure called diaphragm. So this is the setup of thoracic chamber, and the anatomical setup of the thoracic chamber is such that any change in the volume of thoracic chamber will be reflected in the volume of the lungs. So as we cannot directly alter the volume of the lungs, it is a necessary need for us to inspire and expire the air. Okay, now let's look at the steps that are involved in the process of respiration. So the first step of the process of respiration is breathing, and it is also called as pulmonary ventilation. Okay, in this process we actually bring in oxygen rich air and release out carbon dioxide rich air. So the first step of respiration is breathing, and it is also called as pulmonary ventilation. Second step of the respiration is diffusion of the gases that are O2 and CO2 across alveolar membrane. So the second step of the respiration is diffusion of the gases that are oxygen and carbon dioxide across alveolar membrane. Next, third step, transport of gases through blood. So the third step of the respiration is transport of gases through blood. And the fourth step is diffusion of gases between the blood and the tissue. Between the blood and tissue. In the second step, diffusion of gases across alveolar membrane, that is between the atmospheric air and the blood. And in the fourth step, diffusion of gases between the blood and the tissues. And coming into the last step, that is fifth step, using of O2 for the catabolic processes. For the catabolic process and releasing of CO2. So the first step in the process of respiration is breathing, that is inspiration of O2 and the expiration of CO2. Then second step is diffusion of gases, that is the exchange of gases between the blood and the atmospheric air, that is the diffusion of gases across the alveolar membrane. And the third step is whatever the gas that has been exchanged, that is O2, has to be taken to the tissues. That is the gas, the O2 will be transported through blood to the tissues. Transport of gases through the blood. Then the fourth step, diffusion of gases between blood and the tissue. The fifth step, using of the O2 for the catabolic processes and releasing of the CO2. These are the steps involved in the process of respiration. In the next video, we will be discussing mechanism of the respiration. It is the most important topic, so please try to watch that video also. And if you are not watched the introduction video, please do watch and please do subscribe to the channel. Thank you.